There is a woman in American history who lost her parents in a plane crash, watched her brother-in-law get assassinated on national television, was standing in the room when her own husband was shot, and then raised 11 children alone while burying two of them. She never remarried. She never stopped showing up. And she lived to be 96 years old, carrying more grief than most families accumulate across generations. This is the tragic marriage of Ethel Kennedy, and the curse they couldn't escape. The girl who became a Kennedy. The story of Ethel Kennedy begins not in a political dynasty, but in a coal empire. She was born Ethel Skakel on April 11th, 1928, in Chicago, Illinois, the sixth of 7 children of George Skakel and Anne Branagh Skakel. George Skakel had started as a railroad clerk, earning $8 a week, then partnered with colleagues to build Great Lakes Carbon Corporation, a company processing coal byproducts that became one of the more quietly successful industrial enterprises in mid-20th century America. By the time Ethel arrived, her parents were millionaires. By the time she was 6, the family had moved east, eventually settling in Greenwich, Connecticut, into a 31-room English country manor on Lake Avenue, the kind of house that announces a family's arrival in a particular world without needing to say a word about it. The Skakels were large, athletic, loud, and Catholic in the way that Irish Catholic families of that era often were. The faith was not incidental to the household, but structural to it. Anne Skakel was a devout daily communicant, and her children were raised in the same orientation, Ethel most completely of all. She was athletic herself, competitive, energetic, direct in a way that people who encountered her as an adult consistently remarked on. She rode horses, she skied, she played every sport available to her. There was a quality about Ethel Skakel from the very beginning that people who knew her described as fundamentally life-affirming, someone for whom the world was essentially interesting and the people in it essentially worth engaging. She was educated at the all-girls Greenwich Academy, then the Convent of the Sacred Heart in the Bronx. In September 1945, she enrolled at Manhattanville College of the Sacred Heart in New York. And it was there that Ethel Skakel became fast friends with a classmate named Jean Kennedy, a warm, social, enormously connected young woman who happened to be one of the 9 children of Joseph and Rose Kennedy of Hyannisport, Massachusetts. Jean and Ethel became roommates, and it was through Jean, in 1945, on a skiing trip to the Mount Tremblant Resort in Quebec, Canada, that 17-year-old Ethel Skakel was introduced to Jean's older brother, Robert Francis Kennedy, known to everyone who loved him as Bobby. There was a complication. Bobby was at that moment dating Ethel's older sister, Patricia Skakel. But these things have a way of sorting themselves out when two people are genuinely drawn to each other, and eventually that relationship ended and Bobby and Ethel started seeing each other. By the time they graduated, he from the University of Virginia Law School, she from Manhattanville, the direction they were moving in was clear. They became engaged in February 1950. They married on June 17, 1950, at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Greenwich, Connecticut, in what the Boston Globe described as a union that brought together 2 large fortunes. More than 1,000 guests attended. The ceremony was Catholic in the way that Ethel had been Catholic her whole life, devoutly, completely, without reservation. She would attend Mass every single day for the rest of her life. The marriage that began that June afternoon would last not quite 18 years. In that time, Ethel and Bobby would have 11 children, transform the American political landscape, become one of the most beloved couples in the country's history, and face a cascade of loss that, even by the standards of a family already defined by tragedy, was almost incomprehensible. But in 1950, the losses had not yet arrived. What had arrived was a life that was, by any objective measure, extraordinary. Hickory Hill and the life they built. The early years of the Kennedy marriage were years of becoming. Bobby becoming a lawyer, then a government attorney, then a figure of genuine national importance, and Ethel becoming the person at the center of everything, the one who kept the household operating, the children fed and organized and loved, the parties planned, the political work supported with unwavering enthusiasm. They lived briefly in Charlottesville, Virginia, while Bobby finished law school, then moved to the Washington area as he went to work for the Justice Department. By 1952, they had moved temporarily to Boston to help with John Kennedy's Senate campaign. Ethel organizing tea parties for potential voters, charming people in the particular way she always had, which was to treat everyone she met as the most interesting person in the room and to mean it genuinely. Their first child, Kathleen, was born on July 4th, 1951. Over the next 17 years, 10 more followed. Joseph, Robert Jr., David, Courtney, Michael, Kerry, Christopher, Maxwell, Douglas, and finally Rory, who would be born 6 months after her father was killed. Ethel had vowed, somewhere in the early days of the marriage, to have more children than her mother-in-law Rose Kennedy, who had 9. She exceeded it by 2. In 1955, the first of the losses arrived. On October 3rd, 1955, both of Ethel's parents, George and Anne Skakel, were killed when their private plane crashed near Union City, Oklahoma. Ethel had just had her 4th child, David. She was 27 years old. Her parents had been the foundation of the large, loud, athletic world she had grown up in, and their deaths together took that foundation suddenly away. The Kennedys gathered around her. She kept going, as she would always keep going, by moving forward rather than stopping. In 1956, Bobby and Ethel purchased Hickory Hill, a 13-bedroom, 13-bathroom estate on 6 acres in McLean, Virginia, just west of Washington. They bought it from Bobby's brother John and his wife Jacqueline, who had found the house too large for their needs at the time. For Ethel and Bobby, with their expanding family and their social ambitions and their genuine love of company, it was exactly right. Hickory Hill became one of the legendary social addresses of Washington in the late 1950s and 1960s. The parties Ethel threw there were famous, not formal in the way that Washington parties often were, but raucous and joyful, full of people who actually wanted to be there. Cabinet members and journalists and artists and athletes all circulated through the same rooms. Someone usually ended up in the pool. Ethel once pushed the American economist Arthur Schlesinger fully clothed into the pool at a garden party, to the enormous delight of the assembled guests. Children ran through everything. The house operated at a volume and energy level that might have exhausted anyone else, but Ethel seemed to generate power from it rather than drain it. She was Bobby's most devoted supporter and his most consistent advocate. When he was chief counsel to the Senate Select Committee investigating organized crime and labor corruption in 1957, her enthusiasm for his work never wavered. When he served as Attorney General under his brother's presidency from 1961, she was there for every moment of the political life. When the Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded in October 1962, and the country held its breath for 13 days, she was at home with the children, managing the household, going to Mass every morning, trusting that the men she loved were equal to what was being asked of them. They were. And then, in November 1963, everything changed. The first of the great losses. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Bobby Kennedy was at Hickory Hill when he heard the news. A call from J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, informing him that his brother had been shot. He was on the phone within minutes, trying to reach the hospital. By early afternoon, JFK was dead. Ethel was there. She watched Bobby absorb the news. She watched what it did to him. The man who emerged from that afternoon was not quite the same man who had walked into it, and the family all understood that without anyone needing to say it. Jack Kennedy's assassination knocked something foundational out of Bobby Kennedy, and the years that followed were shaped by that loss in ways both obvious and invisible. What Ethel did in the period after the assassination was what she always did. She showed up. She managed the house. She kept the children stable. She supported her husband's campaign for the U.S. Senate from New York in 1964, the campaign through which Bobby tried to find a path forward and a purpose to replace the one that had been taken from him. She campaigned alongside him with her characteristic warmth and energy. He won. They moved forward. Bobby worked. He traveled to communities across America that the country's political system had largely forgotten. Appalachia, the Mississippi Delta, Native American reservations, the farm worker camps of California, where Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta were building a movement. Ethel went with him on many of those trips, and what she saw in those places, the depth of poverty in the richest country on earth, the dignity of people whose circumstances were considered unremarkable by the systems that created them, stayed with her for the rest of her life and shaped the humanitarian work she would do after Bobby was gone. By the mid-1960s, with the Vietnam War escalating and the country convulsing with the moral demands of the civil rights movement, Bobby Kennedy was evolving in public in ways that his political world found alternately inspiring and alarming. The assassination of his brother had cracked something open in him. He had become more attentive to suffering, more willing to say things out loud that politicians of his background typically left unspoken, more genuinely moved by the people the political system was built to ignore. He quoted Aeschylus from memory at campaign events. He visited migrant worker camps and sat on the floors of one-room shacks with families who had nothing and who responded to his presence with a trust that his advisors found almost as remarkable as it was politically useful. He was moving towards something larger than any single issue or office. And by early 1968, with Lyndon Johnson's presidency weakening under the pressure of the war, the conversation inside the Kennedy world had shifted to whether Bobby should run. Ethel was his most consistent advocate for entering the race. A biographer described her as pushing harder than anyone else around him, the voice that said he had to try, that the country needed him in a way that made declining the responsibility unacceptable. She knew what the race would mean. She knew what it would cost them in terms of privacy, of safety, of the ordinary life they had been trying to build in the years since Dallas. If she had private fears about what might happen, she kept them entirely to herself and showed Bobby only certainty. Bobby Kennedy announced his candidacy for the Democratic presidential nomination on March 16, 1968. Ethel was 3 months pregnant with their 11th child, and the campaign that followed was one of the most exhilarating and most heartbreaking in American political history. The night at the Ambassador Hotel. The campaign was extraordinary. Bobby Kennedy in 1968 carried something that no other candidate in the field possessed: an ability to speak to Americans across the most profound divisions in the country's life. He reached communities that had never felt addressed by a politician of his background. He spoke at the funeral of Martin Luther King Jr. in April, after King was assassinated in Memphis on April 4th, and his words that night in Indianapolis, delivered to a mostly black crowd who had not yet heard the news, are remembered as among the most remarkable pieces of public address in American history. He walked through neighborhoods that were burning with grief and rage, and people reached for him in a way they reached for almost no one else in public life that year. Ethel was with him throughout, pregnant, tireless, projecting the same warmth and confidence she always had, appearing at events and rallies, representing everything that was warmest about the Kennedy name and the Kennedy idea. She was not a background presence. She was part of what the campaign communicated, a woman of genuine engagement and genuine joy, who believed in what her husband was doing with the particular intensity of someone who had chosen it freely rather than because it was required. On June 4th, 1968, California held its Democratic presidential primary. Bobby Kennedy won. He delivered his victory speech in the ballroom of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles just before midnight, thanking his supporters and his campaign team, mentioning by name the farm workers of Delano who had supported him and the communities that had believed in the campaign. He expressed, with the particular clarity he had developed in those final weeks, something that sounded like hope and felt like something rarer, like the beginning of something rather than the end. Ethel was there, in the kitchen corridor of the Ambassador Hotel, when the shots rang out. Sirhan fired at Robert Kennedy shortly after midnight on June 5th, 1968. 3 bullets struck Bobby. Campaign aide Juan Romero, a 17-year-old busboy at the hotel, cradled Bobby's head on the floor in the moments after the shooting, placing a rosary in his hands. Bobby Kennedy was 42 years old. He died the following day, June 6th, at Good Samaritan Hospital in Los Angeles. Ethel was by his side throughout those final hours. She was 39 years old. She was 3 months pregnant. The last moments she had with him, she was holding his hand. When he died, she was the mother of 10 living children and 1 yet to be born. The 11th, Rory, who would enter the world 6 months later in December 1968, and who would never know her father except through photographs and the testimony of the people who had loved him. The country's grief was enormous and visible. President Johnson declared a national day of mourning. More than 150,000 people stood in lines, stretching for miles to pay their respects at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, where Bobby's body lay in state. The funeral train that carried him from New York to Washington, where he was buried at Arlington National Cemetery near his brother John, passed through towns and cities where people stood at the tracks in silence or on their knees, holding flags and flowers, some of them weeping, some of them simply standing with a stillness that said everything about what they were feeling. Ethel sent President Johnson a handwritten note of thanks on June 19th, acknowledging what he had done for her family. She was composed in public with a composure that had nothing theatrical about it. It was the composure of someone who understood that grief was not a performance, and that the people around her needed steadiness. She gave it to them. After Bobby's burial, she made a public statement. She would not remarry. She wanted to devote herself to furthering his work and his legacy. It was not a vow made in the first raw days of shock and then quietly revised. She kept it for the remaining 56 years of her life. Raising 11 alone. Ethel Kennedy returned to Hickory Hill with 10 children, 1 unborn, and a household that had been built around a man who was no longer in it. The flags across the country flew at half-staff. The world sent condolences. And Ethel began the quieter, harder work of going on. Friends who visited Hickory Hill in the months after Bobby's death described a house still humming with life. The children still in school, still playing, still needing breakfast and bedtime, and someone to resolve their arguments. And Ethel providing all of it with an energy that people found almost difficult to comprehend in someone who had just become a widow at 39. She was not performing recovery. She was doing the work that 11 children required, and she was finding in that work something to hold on to when everything else had been taken. What she did in the years that followed was remarkable, and also complicated in ways that even those who loved her most have acknowledged honestly. She raised 11 children largely on her own, in a house that was simultaneously a national monument and a family home, surrounded by the memory of a husband who had been one of the most significant figures in American public life, and the grief of losing him at 39. She had support, financial, social, familial, that most widowed mothers could not have accessed. The Kennedy family circled its wagons, as they always did. The staff at Hickory Hill continued. The broader world of Kennedys and Skakels and family friends continued to move through the house. Ted Kennedy took on something of the role of paternal figure to the children in the years after Bobby's death. But the fundamental job, the daily job of being present for 11 children through their particular struggles and needs and crises, of making decisions about discipline and education and health, and all the ordinary and extraordinary things that parenting requires, was hers, and hers alone. The 11 children spanned enormous range in age and circumstance. Kathleen, the eldest, was 17 when her father was killed, old enough to understand what had happened and to grieve it with some adult comprehension. Rory, the youngest, was born into a household already shaped by that loss, and knew her father only as a presence in photographs and stories. Between those two, 9 children were navigating the grief at different ages with different resources, and Ethel was trying to hold all of them simultaneously while managing her own loss in whatever time and space was left over. She was a mother of enormous love and notable spontaneity, someone whose children described childhoods full of animals and adventure and laughter and genuine warmth, but also a degree of chaos that the absence of a steady paternal presence contributed to. Bobby had been the disciplinarian in the family, the one who enforced structure. With him gone, the household's energy, already considerable, became harder to contain. The children struggled in varying degrees with the weight of the Kennedy name and the Kennedy tragedy, which were inseparable. They had grown up as public figures simply by virtue of being born into that family, and their father's assassination had made them objects of public grief and scrutiny that no child could have been fully prepared for. Some of them found ways to carry it. Others were crushed by it. Andy Williams, the singer who had been a family friend for years, began escorting Ethel to events in the years after Bobby's death, to dinners and theatres and public occasions where appearing alone would have been difficult. The press speculated about the nature of their friendship, particularly as Williams's own marriage was troubled. Williams was consistent throughout his life that the relationship was platonic, that Ethel was a dear friend, nothing more. Ethel never addressed the speculation directly. After Williams divorced his wife and remarried another woman, he and Ethel remained friends in the quieter way of people who had weathered public scrutiny together and come out the other side. She founded the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights in 1968, in the months between her husband's death and Rory's birth. She worked with the Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration Project in Brooklyn, supporting community development in one of New York's most underserved neighborhoods. She took up the causes Bobby had championed and made them her own. She did not put herself at the center of public life. She put the work at the center and used her name and her energy to advance it. The losses, however, had not finished arriving. David and Michael, the children she couldn't save. David Anthony Kennedy was born on June 15, 1955, the same year that both of Ethel's parents were killed in a plane crash. He was the fourth of her 11 children, and he bore his father's name as his middle name, a weight he wore throughout his life. In June 1968, David was 12 years old. He was in a hotel room when he watched the television coverage of his father's final campaign appearance at the Ambassador Hotel. He saw, on screen, the moment the shots were fired. He saw the chaos in the ballroom. He did not know his father was dying until someone came to tell him. By nearly every account from people who knew him, David Kennedy was never quite the same after that night. He had watched his father shot on television, alone, as a 12-year-old boy, and that experience marked him with a damage that was specifically his own, different from what his siblings carried, different from what his mother carried. He began using drugs as a teenager and struggled with addiction for years, through various attempts at treatment and periods of apparent stability that didn't hold. On April 25, 1984, David Kennedy was found in his room at the Brazilian Court Hotel in Palm Beach, Florida. He was 28 years old. The cause of death was an accidental overdose. He had been in the area visiting family. The years of struggle had been visible to those around him, and the treatments and interventions had not produced the stability everyone had hoped for. Ethel Kennedy had raised this child from infancy. She had watched him carry the specific damage of that night in 1968, the night the 12-year-old boy in the hotel room watched his father shot on television, through his entire life. She had sat with the reality that what happened to Bobby had happened to David in its own particular and unhealing way, and that she had not been able to protect him from it. She buried him, and she went on, because that was what she did. It was not that she did not grieve. It was that she had come to understand grief as something you carry alongside life rather than instead of it. Michael Lemoyne Kennedy was born on February 27, 1958, the sixth of Ethel and Bobby's 11 children. He worked in politics and social policy, was close to his mother and his siblings, and was, by all accounts, a person of genuine warmth and considerable charisma. Someone who carried the Kennedy gifts without, for most of his life, the Kennedy curse. In the mid-1990s, his name appeared in press coverage connected to an alleged personal scandal. He was skiing at Aspen, Colorado, with family on New Year's Eve, December 31st, 1997, when he struck a tree. The impact was fatal. He was 39 years old, the same age his father had been when he was killed. The family friend Philip Johnson, quoted in the press after Michael's death, said something that expressed what many who observed the Kennedy family had come to feel: that one wonders how much any family could be expected to absorb. Ethel had now buried 2 of her children. The losses that kept coming. The Kennedy family's accumulation of loss did not stop with the generation that had lived through Dallas and Los Angeles. It extended outward into the generation that followed. In July 1999, Ethel's daughter Rory, the child who had been born 6 months after Bobby was killed, the daughter who had never known her father, was preparing to be married. Her wedding was scheduled for July 17th on Cape Cod. It was to be a celebration, a moment of genuine joy in a family that had known so few uncomplicated ones. On the eve of the wedding, John F. Kennedy Jr., the son of the assassinated president and a first cousin to all of Ethel's children, was piloting a small Piper Saratoga plane toward the Cape with his wife, Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, and her sister, Lauren. The plane went down into the Atlantic Ocean near Martha's Vineyard at around 9:40 at night. There were no survivors. John was 38 years old, the same age his father had been when he was elected president. His death, and the timing of it, on the very eve of Rory's wedding, on the approach to the family gathering, created a particular grief that was layered on top of all the others in a way that required a specific kind of fortitude to navigate. The family gathered and made a collective decision. The wedding would proceed, because that was what would have been wanted. But the joy of it was shadowed by a loss that had arrived on its very threshold, and the photographs from that day carry the weight of both things simultaneously. In 2019, Ethel's granddaughter, Sarah Kennedy Hill, the daughter of Ethel's daughter Courtney, died of an accidental drug overdose at the Kennedy compound in Massachusetts. She was 22 years old. Ethel was 91 when she learned that another generation had paid the price of a pattern no one could fully explain or prevent. Through all of it, Ethel Kennedy kept going. She attended funerals. She gave eulogies. She sat in the front rows of churches that the Kennedy family had filled with grief more times than anyone should have to count. She received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Obama in 2014, an acknowledgement of a lifetime devoted to the causes her husband had championed. She continued going to Mass every morning. She continued showing up for the living people around her. She outlived almost everyone who had been at the center of the story when the story began. She outlived Jackie Kennedy, who died in 1994 at 64. She outlived Ted Kennedy, who died of a brain tumor in 2009. She outlived her brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, who died in 2011. She outlived most of the political generation her husband had belonged to, and many of the children she had raised alongside her own. She reached 96, an age that nobody around her in 1968, standing in the corridor of the Ambassador Hotel, watching her world end in real time, could possibly have predicted. She reached it by continuing, one morning at a time, to show up for the life that was still in front of her. The faith that held her together. People who knew Ethel Kennedy well across the decades consistently returned to the same explanation for how she did it, how she absorbed what she absorbed and remained, if not unbroken, then at least standing. The answer was faith. She was a devout Catholic in the way that was complete rather than circumstantial. Not observant because it was expected of her by her background and her marriage, but genuinely, daily, practically religious in the way that faith functions as a structural support rather than a social performance. She attended Mass every morning of her adult life. That was not a statement of piety or a habit maintained for appearances. It was a daily practice that she sustained through grief and joy and ordinary middle-of-the-week Tuesdays with equal consistency. She received the sacraments. She prayed, not in the performed way of public figures whose religion is partly a constituency, but in the private way of someone who actually believed that the conversation was real and the relationship it constituted was ongoing. Her children have described a mother who talked about God and about death and about the people she had lost with a matter-of-factness that was its own form of peace. She did not perform composure about the losses. She actually possessed it. And when her children or grandchildren asked how she kept going, and they did ask, over decades, she gave them the same answer in various forms, that the people she had lost were not gone, that they were somewhere more coherent than here, and that she expected to see them again. That theology was not consolation. It was conviction. And the children who grew up watching her live by it came to understand that it was at least part of what made her capable of enduring what she endured. Her children have described a mother who talked about God and faith with the same directness she brought to everything else, not with any sense of performance or piety, but with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting a functional fact. This is what holds the world together. This is what holds me together. Act accordingly. The Catholicism was also, by her own telling, why she had no interest in remarrying. Her marriage to Bobby had not ended with a divorce or a choice. It had ended because someone shot him in a hotel kitchen while she was 3 months pregnant, and in her understanding of what that marriage had been, it had not ended at all. She wanted people to address her as Mrs. Kennedy, and she continued using Bobby's name and honoring his memory, not as a way of holding herself back from life, but as an active commitment to a relationship she regarded as ongoing. They were separated. They were not finished. Whether that theology of continuing connection was literally what sustained her, or whether it was the practical framework within which she organized a resilience that was fundamentally her own character, both were probably true. She was, by all available evidence, a person of considerable inherent strength, who found in her faith a language and a structure that made that strength legible to herself and to the people around her. The legacy she built from the wreckage. Ethel Kennedy died on October 10, 2024, in Boston, Massachusetts, from complications of a stroke she had suffered the week before. She was 96 years old. She left behind 9 living children. 2, David and Michael, had preceded her, 34 grandchildren, and 24 great-grandchildren. Her funeral was held at Our Lady of Victory Church in Centerville, Massachusetts. A memorial service followed at the Cathedral of St. Matthew the Apostle in Washington, D.C., where Presidents Biden, Obama, and Clinton gave eulogies. Each of them said something true about her, and none of what they said was primarily about the grief. It was about what she had done with it, which was the more remarkable story. She had founded the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights in 1968, in the months between her husband's death and her youngest child's birth. That organization, now known as Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, has operated for more than half a century, using Bobby's name and Ethel's organizational energy and the Kennedy family's capacity to generate attention to advance causes that would otherwise struggle for resources or visibility. Human rights, environmental justice, the rights of incarcerated people, the conditions of the world's most vulnerable populations. These were the areas where Ethel directed her grief. She co-chaired the Coalition for Gun Control. She traveled to Eastern Europe in 1992 with her children Michael and Courtney to donate medical equipment. She went to Kenya in 1997 to support democratic reforms. She stood across from the White House in 1998 with protesters against human rights abuses in Tibet. None of this was ceremonial. All of it was chosen because she thought it mattered. President Biden said at her memorial service that Ethel Kennedy had a spine of steel and a heart of gold that had inspired millions of Americans, and that she had been there for him after he lost his own wife and daughter, that she had taught him, through her example, how to channel grief into the service of something larger. That observation captures something essential. What Ethel Kennedy did with the losses she sustained was not transcend them or move past them. She transformed them. She took the grief and made it fuel. She went to her grave with the name Mrs. Kennedy, still the one she preferred, still the wife of Bobby, still the widow who had chosen 56 years ago to honor a promise made in a Catholic church in Connecticut and to keep it regardless of what the world brought. Her family noted in the statement announcing her death that they were comforted in knowing she was reunited with the love of her life, her children, David and Michael, her daughter-in-law Mary, and her grandchildren Maeve and Saoirse. The Kennedy family had always been shadowed by the question of whether there was something in their story that went beyond ordinary misfortune, some accumulation of tragedy so concentrated that it seemed to demand a name. The curse was always more poetic than explanatory, a way of making sense of what otherwise resisted it. But Ethel Kennedy never seemed to spend much time on that question. She did not have the luxury of asking whether the losses were meaningful. She had children to raise, work to do, and Mass to attend in the morning. And she did all of it for 96 years. And when she died, those who had known her longest said the same thing, that she had been the most resilient person they had ever encountered, and the most loving, and that the two things had always been, for her, the same thing. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.